David's pretty straight up with Solomon, gives him some solid advice, tells him a little bit about what he's been doing and how he has come through his kingdom or his reign successfully, and now he's passing the torch on to Solomon. And when we think about David at this point in our lives, in his life, I think about kind of the term legacy and what is, he's passing along this authority and the throne, and yet at the same time he's also thinking about preserving something, right? Like you're passing something on so that something else can be preserved as well. And we all have this desire that our reputation, how people look back on us, would be positive and inspiring and good, right? Like we all kind of want to have people look back and say, man, now that was a good person, right? Like no one wants to have us look back and say, well, that person was a scoundrel, right? And I was looking at the time, but we don't have time for the joke, so the joke's going to have to wait. You'll have to ask me after service, and I'll tell you my bad preacher joke about this. But David, if you're going to pass on a good legacy, I think there are some things that we can learn from David. We're going to jump right into it instead. And the first thing that I think we can learn from David is that a good legacy starts with God. A good legacy starts with God. You notice how David responds to Solomon, right? He brings everybody together. He's got all of the important people, all the people that Solomon is going to need to manage and lead and give responsibility to so that the kingdom can continue to function well. He brings all of those people together, and then he spends most of his time talking about God. Did you catch that? Like, it's not until the last couple of verses that David actually addresses Solomon, and then he addresses him primarily in terms of make sure you're faithful to God, right? But he begins this whole section by talking about how God has been active in his own life, in David's life, from the very beginning. Because he wants Solomon to know something, that a good legacy doesn't begin with you, it begins outside of you, it begins with God. David reminded Solomon that he didn't choose to be king on his own. He didn't manipulate things so that he could become king. In fact, he waited very patiently for God to act, because God was the one who chose him. God was the one who anointed him. God was the one who established his kingdom. And David wants Solomon to know, if you're going to have a good legacy in life, you've got to wait for God to move. You've got to wait for God to act. You've got to be dependent on what God is doing and line up with that. God chose me, David said, and God has likewise chosen you, Solomon. I want to tell you this morning that God has chosen you. That God has looked down from heaven and he sees you, and he has chosen you for a specific thing in this life. Maybe it's to lead your family. Maybe it's to bless your neighborhood. Maybe it's to be that person in your school or in your workplace or here at the church. But God has chosen you. And if you're going to leave a legacy, if you're going to leave a trail of blessing behind you, I want to tell you something. You got to remember that it's not all about you. It starts with God. Because if you make it all about you, sooner or later, people are going to realize that, and they're not going to be too happy about jumping on your bandwagon. But if you're serving something bigger than you, if you're lining up behind somebody who's bigger than you, then people are going to jump in behind you too. David says that legacy starts with God. Acknowledging God's action in our own life helps our heirs to recognize God's action in their life. You see, when we start with God, then he's the one who gets the credit for our accomplishments. You will be remembered, but you'll be remembered as one who was faithful with what God has entrusted to you. A good legacy starts with God. And who better to trust your legacy with than God? Right? Who better to trust your reputation with than the one who's going to continue to preserve you into eternity? Like if you're trusting him to keep you in eternity, which I am, right? Like my whole hope, my whole confidence about life after death is based in Jesus Christ and the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So my entire eternity is based on Jesus. If I'm trusting him with my entire eternity, perhaps I can trust him with my reputation. So why don't we? There's no one better to trust with your reputation. When you make your success about you, people will take what you leave them, and they will follow your example and make it about them, and you will be forgotten. But if you take what has been given to you and you make it about God, then those who come behind you will also likely follow your example and take what you leave them and make it about God, and your name will become part of that ongoing story. It won't be paved over. When you make it about God, he keeps your memory alive because your memory becomes part of his ongoing kingdom work. Your legacy, a good legacy, starts with God. Secondly, I think the thing that David tells us is that your legacy is more than just your money. A lot of times when we think about inheritance, all we think about is money. But no, I think there are three things here that David was intentional about passing down to Solomon. First of all, he was intentional about passing down faith. You can't get past the words that David just told Solomon, right? Learn to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Worship and serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind. What was David doing? He was saying, listen, faith is the most important thing that I can pass down to you, that I can model for you, that I can help you to recognize how important and how significant this is. And so what did David do to help his family, to help Solomon know that faith was important? He put his money into a place that would establish faith as part of the community, as part of the reality that Solomon lived in. David said, here, I've got all these preparations for what? For the temple. What's the temple going to do? It's going to be a visible representation. It's going to be a visible place where God's presence and power are going to be smack dab in the middle of Solomon's life. Solomon can't wake up in the morning and look out the window without seeing the temple that David has left everything for. Where did David leave his money? He left it in a place that was going to enhance the likelihood that Solomon's faith would grow and be nurtured. David used his money to help increase the chances that those who came behind him would serve the Lord. I would encourage you this morning to think about leaving some of your money to organizations that will continue to speak faith into the lives of your children, your grandchildren, that your money would increase faith and would pass along faith. Maybe some of it goes to the church, some of it to mission organizations or Christian schools or nonprofits. Think about the places in the communities where your children are going to be impacted by the gospel, and leave some of your wealth to those places so that they continue to speak faith into the lives of your children when you can't do that physically anymore. Pass down faith. And don't just do that with your money, but take time to talk with your children. Take time to talk with your grandchildren about the beliefs that have shaped your life and the benefits of faith in your life. Not just why you want them to believe, but how faith has helped you, about how faith has shaped who you are and made you who you are today. Sometimes we just tell them, you need to do this. But we don't tell them how it has shaped us and how our faith has helped us through the struggles. We should talk about that. Have those conversations. Right? Like my grandmother loved to have these type of conversations, and she would lure us in with molasses cookies and milk. And then we'd get cornered in the kitchen. But you wouldn't leave because the cookies were so good. And Grandma she could talk for hours on about faith and about how her faith had sustained her and guided her through her life. And even though I didn't really like it then, I'll always remember it. Those conversations about she was passing down faith. Are you passing down faith? And don't wait until you're old to do this. Like some of you are thinking, man, this sermon is just for all the old people here this morning. Well, it's not. Because you got to start early. You got to create a culture where those conversations can happen naturally, or else when you're old, they're not going to listen to you. Right? Like if you wait until they're old, they might listen to you respectfully, but then they're going to go out the window and go, man, grandma's lost it. We know that she's kooky. But if you start now with young kids in your home, talking about faith, having those conversations about what God is doing and how faith is shaping your life and your family, then when you're old and you have that conversation, it's going to be taking them back to a very special memory. You're going to be taking them back to their childhood. You're going to be taking them back to those special moments around the kitchen table or on the couch or in the car. And they're going to be reliving those moments with you because you passed down faith. But David also passed down wisdom. He took time to share with Solomon, and I didn't read this next section, but he goes through all the instructions about how the temple should be constructed and who's to do what, and he passed down all this wisdom that he had received in his life. This is how you do it. Here's the words of the wise. Sometimes Solomon said this in Ecclesiastes. He says, sometimes the words of the wise, this is the Message translation, are like cattle prods. Painful, but helpful. Pass down wisdom. Pass down words of wisdom and insight. Because you know what? Those things are going to go further than your money. It's no coincidence that Solomon asked in his primary prayer to God when God said, ask for whatever you want. Here's your wish, right? Solomon rubs his prayer genie bottle and out pops God, and God says, here's your one, ask for anything you want. It's almost like, it's like, wow, we wish that we could have that moment with God sometimes. And Solomon gets this chance. And what does he ask for? He asks for wisdom. Give me wisdom. Because he knew from his dad's advice and his dad's wisdom that had been spoken into his life that wisdom would take him further than money would. He asked for wisdom. James chapter 3, verse 13 tells us, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life and deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. And so don't just speak wisdom, live wisdom. You know what wisdom is? Wisdom is knowledge applied rightly. Wisdom is taking information and putting it into action in positive and good ways. That's what wisdom is. It's not just information. Sometimes we get stuck in just passing down information. No, pass down wisdom. In order to do that, you have to rightly apply that information that you have received from God's Word, from the Spirit, from others in your life. You have to apply that rightly. But when you do, you're able to pass down wisdom. The third thing that I see that David passed down here was his character. Pass down character. It's more important than wealth. Because if you leave a whole bunch of money to somebody with bad character, they're going to squander that. And so if you want the wealth that you leave behind to be used well, you've got to make sure that you've instilled character in those that you leave it with. Pass down character. Help your children, help your grandchildren. Take the time to instill in them characteristics and attributes like honesty and respect and hard work and caring for others and loving others. Show them what integrity looks like and reward that in their lives. Start early. Start when they're young. Building character, shaping their character. That's your primary responsibility after sharing your faith and helping them to know Jesus, is to shape their character. It's to help them to know what it looks like to be a real man of God or woman of God. And you've got to do more than just tell them, you've got to model that. Pass these things down. Faith, and wisdom, and character. And plan now. Plan now for your legacy. Be intentional about preparation. Like sometimes we put this off. It's easy to put off because it's stuff that we don't want to talk about. It's stuff that we don't want to bother with. It's not going to affect me anyways, right? It's going to affect them. So I just kind of put it off. But be intentional, right? So I would say talk to your children about the causes you believe in and support. Have those conversations. David believed in the temple. He had made preparations for the construction of it, and he talked to his son about it. This is what I'm passionate about. Here's the stuff I've prepared for it. Here's how to do it. Now it's up to you to put it into action. He entrusted him with the plan. Be intentional about your preparation. David knew he wasn't going to build it, but he prepared for it anyways. Sometimes we think, well, I'm not going to do it, so why should I bother with it? Because it's part of your legacy. Be prepared. Be prepared and provide for the work that you're going to entrust those who come behind you with. Work with the organizations that you want to leave money towards. So like if you want to leave money here at the church, then come and talk to us so that we know what your passions are and we can continue on the things that you care about with the resources you leave. If you're leaving it to another organization, then go and talk to them and tell them, this is what I plan to do, and here's why I'm passionate about this organization, and here's how I'd love for this money to be utilized to further these dreams and goals that God has put into my heart. Meet with the leaders. Put plans in place that align with the vision of the organization and the passions that God has given you. Be intentional about that. Don't wait until it's too late. And along with that, work hard to have your house in order. Right? Avoid putting things off until obviously it's too late. There are necessary documents and things that make it a whole lot easier for your children and grandchildren. Put them in place. Have them done. Don't just think, oh, it'll never happen to me. I can just wait until, I'm retired. No, do that now. And then talk to your children about your plans. Like your plans should not be a surprise to your children when they read your will. They should know what your heart's passions are. They should know the things that you want to see continue. And listen to your kids' feedback because they're the ones that are going to be implementing the plan that you put in place. And so they might have some good constructive feedback for you that would help you to shape that plan so that it will actually be carried out just the way that you want it to be done. You don't have to do what your kids want necessarily, but your plans will impact them. So take time to learn to see how that impact is shaping their lives and what input they might give you that would shape the plan itself. And start creating that legacy while you're alive. Like one of the beautiful things that I see some families do is they begin to, as they downsize from one place to another, they begin to pass along those things that they want to pass along to their children or grandchildren while they're still living. Then you can enjoy them when you go and visit them. Unless, of course, they sell it. But then you can enjoy what they wanted to use that money for as well. You can see how you've blessed them. Like, don't try to control it, but just see that how you've been able to be a blessing to them. And enjoy that because you know what? When it comes down to the road, or it comes down to it, your kids are more important than that thing was anyways, aren't they? Value what really matters to you. Value what values. Don't get hung up on the little stuff. Start creating that legacy now. And the last thing that I think I see here in David is that he was inspirational in his legacy. Your legacy should challenge the next generation to faithfulness and ongoing generosity. David challenged Solomon to continue to be faithful to God so that Solomon might have the same opportunity to leave his children and grandchildren with the land and the gift that David had left him. There was a challenge there. There was an inspiring opportunity to step into something bigger than himself. That's what David created with this legacy. And when you focus on the right things, when you focused on character, when you focused on wisdom, when you focused on faith, then you can have confidence that the next generation is going to take the material wealth that you leave them and use it for something even bigger than what you were able to do. Because you've resourced them and taught them well. They've been trained in how to use the gifts that they receive. But make sure that your legacy is inspiring in a way that builds generosity, Because as you do that, guess what? That only expands the legacy that you're leaving behind. I think of David doing this, and I think David learned from his examples. He learned from Saul how not to leave a legacy. King Saul was all about himself, all about his own reputation, all about his own plans. And he tried to manage everything and control everything, and guess what? At the end of the day, Saul lost everything. His family lost the throne, he lost his life, and he was looked down on as not a good guy to follow. In fact, when we think of King Saul today, we think of a king that did not follow God, who was not a good example for the people. But there was another mentor for King David, a mentor by the name of Samuel. And Samuel, early in his ministry, had led the Israelites on a campaign against the Philistines shortly after Eli and his sons had died and the ark had been captured and made its hilarious way back into the camp of the Israelites. There's some exciting reading if you want to read that back in 1 Samuel. But shortly after that, Samuel leads the Israelites in a military campaign against the Philistines. And they have this great victory, and Samuel sets up this stone, and he names the stone Ebenezer. Not Ebenezer Scrooge, just Ebenezer. Because the word Ebenezer meant, thus far the Lord has helped us. And every time that David must have walked past that stone, he would have said, God's still helping us. God's still helping us. And I think it was that legacy that Samuel had left for the people of Israel. Not just that incident, but throughout the other acts of Samuel and his life. He left this legacy of faith, of wisdom, of character, of stepping into something bigger than himself, stepping into what God was doing. And so I ask you this morning, what are you leaving? What are you passing on to the next generation? Are you passing along an Ebenezer, a sign of God's presence and power? Or are you trying to pass along just something good about you? It's really all about you. You're kind of like Saul. I'd encourage you this morning, be bigger than Saul was. Be more like Samuel, be more like David. And let your legacy inspire the next generation to take it even further for God, to be even more generous and more faithful as they use the resources that you've left them. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your grace. Thank you for the way that you minister to us. Thank you for all the ways that you have provided for us. Thank you for the blessings that you have given to us. And Lord, as we steward those, I pray that you give us wisdom to steward them well today, and also to know how to leave them as we prepare to come to be with you, each and every one of us someday. Lord, that we would leave a legacy of faithfulness, that we would leave a legacy of generosity, that we would leave a legacy that inspires others to walk with God, to grow in faith, and to be men and women of character and integrity. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.